how do you live in joy? How do you rejoice in a world that is so full of wickedness and evil and suffering? At some point, it becomes impossible to ignore the fact that the world really is a very nasty place in a lot of ways. And I'm not even talking about the big ways, the Holocausts and the wars and the murders. I'm talking about the little compromises and sellouts that people make every day for $1 or for safety or for popularity, the thing that makes us the broken people we are. And I thought, we're all living in that world, and we're all part of that world, and we're all part of the brokenness of that world. When the Bible says, rejoice evermore, how do you begin to do that without closing your eyes or without becoming one of those Christians who pretends everything is a blessing and has to hide his pain and hide his suffering and his fear about living in a world like this? And this actually applied to me particularly because I've spent all my life as a crime writer, a crime novelist, writing about evil, writing about murder and about the crimes people do and about low people who do terrible things. And frequently, Christians have said to me, you call yourself a Christian and yet you write about those things. And I thought, yes, I do, because that is the way I see the world, and it is in that world that I want to find beauty and joy. Can you define evil? People look at it in different ways without really thinking it through. Some people think that good is a secondary trait. So you think of doctors and soldiers and police officers are doing good, but in order for them to do good, there has to be disease and there has to be crime and there has to be war. And so you're always looking at people as good if they are fighting the evil, which means the evil comes first. And that is a really interesting way to look at life, because it puts you in the position of thinking any good you do is really secondary to the evil that's inside you. I don't actually believe that's true. I believe that you start out to find a moral ethos, a moral way of behaving, and you have to believe two things. One, you have to believe that other people's inner lives are just as important to them as your inner life is to you, and then you have to believe that both of them are equal at some level to God. There has to be some standard, some overwatching standard that says both of these things are things that I love, these inner lives are things that I love. And so what I believe is that evil is actually the absence of that love. It's the absence of the recognition of yourself in others and God in others. And that's why murder is the ultimate expression of evil, because it essentially erases an entire other experience of the world, an entire other inner life that is just as creative, just as interesting, and just as deep as yours is to the person living it. And so I believe that evil is the disconnect from love, basically, and love is actually the primary state of human beings. I've often asked myself why so many stories deal with evil, and why the great movies deal with evil, the great novels so often deal with evil. And I really think the reason is because it is an indisputable example of the borderline of morality. The idea, if you are a materialist, it's easy to convince yourself that morality is a fiction, that it's something that we kind of make up, it's game theory, or it's evolutionary psychology, or it's any of these things. But when you actually see what one person does to another when he commits murder, for instance, you understand, no, that's not true. There is no place, if you went to a planet of Nazis or murderers, they would still be wrong even though they all thought they were right. It doesn't take an opinion to change that. And so when you deal with that, you then begin to bounce back into the more important question of what does it mean to be good? Does it just mean correcting this, or does it mean living in such a way that you can achieve something? Is there a purpose to your life? Is there a purpose to being you? And of course, as a Christian, I very much believe there is, and I think that that road to that purpose is actually built into your personality. There is somebody, and everyone knows this deep down, there's somebody that you're supposed to be that you are not. And when you find that North Star that is God and start walking toward it, you start to find that as you leave yourself behind, you actually find the self that you were meant to be. And that is an incredibly beautiful thing. And in some ways, it starts with the acknowledgement that there's a border to the moral order, and that border expresses itself in evil very clearly, whereas the good is something you have to move toward slowly as it unfolds before you. One of the things I love about being an artist is I believe an art is an act of the spirit, that the spirit moves through me to create art. Most artists believe that art comes through them, not out of themselves. And because of that, it turns everything it touches into creation, which is the opposite of evil because it's the purpose of love. Creation is the purpose of love. And so everything that art touches turns to light in some ways. And that's why I actually feel that reading about stories of darkness can lead you into the light. It seems like a paradox, but it actually is built into the system of art and into the system of ritual and into the system of worship. And I think it's one of the centerpieces of a well-lived life. One of my great fears when I realized that I was becoming a Christian, or that I had become a Christian, was that I would become a Christian novelist. And I remember actually praying to God and saying, "Oh, dear Lord, please do not let me become a Christian novelist." And the reason I felt like that is that I naturally write very hard-boiled stories about very hard-boiled people doing very terrible things. And I thought, I just hate these stories that are supposed to be family-friendly or Christian-friendly, in which everything goes fine and you pray and you always get what you pray for, and yes, you go through a dark period, but ultimately it all turns out right if you believe in God. Well, that's true in eternity, but it is not true in the real world. And so I was very much afraid that I would start writing Christian fiction, which I really dislike, mostly. Modern Christian fiction I really dislike. But instead, something else happened, which was that understanding that there is a moral order and coming to know it more deeply through the Bible and through worship, I started to see the world as a very, very dark place. And in fact, my outlook on life became much, much darker. And at the same time, weirdly enough, I became a much more joyful person. And that was because I had an outlook that was actually larger than life, literally larger than life. I didn't see things as ending with death. I saw things as being contained within a larger context. And what I've now tried to capture in my work is not the ridiculous idea that everything works out for the best, that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, none of which is true. I mean, if a murder victim never gets justice in this world, what I try to do is make all of my characters live within the moral order that I know is there. And that means that there is a price you pay for everything. And the price sometimes that you pay for being a good person is being excoriated or less popular. If you tell the truth, maybe you're not as popular as somebody who lies. If you don't compromise your morals, maybe you don't make as much money as the guy next to you. That's the price you pay for that. The price you pay for evil is meaninglessness and separation from God, which is hell both here and I believe in eternity. And so at the same time, my view of the world has become quite dark. My inner world has become quite joyful. And that seems a paradox, but it's a paradox I would like to at least present to other people through my work. I see a lot of people who hesitate on the threshold of faith because of the question of evil. How can an all-good, all-knowing God allow evil? There's always philosophical explanations for that. God believes in our freedom, and that means he lets us do bad things. I think that's true. But there's also all kinds of evils in the world that really have nothing to do with freedom, and it doesn't really explain the Dostoevskian question of how can the evil that is done ever be made good? If a child suffers, can that ever be made good, even over the course of all eternity? And what I argue is that art starts to suggest an answer to that question that is not philosophical, that is actually emotional and sensual. And that is this, that you can't see the beauty of a design when you're in the design. When you look at a statue, for instance, the Pietà by Michelangelo, this is one of the most beautiful pieces of human work ever made. It is uncannily beautiful, and yet it depicts the worst thing that ever happened in the world. Not just the worst thing that can ever happen to a person, which is the death of a child, but it's the death of God, it's the death of all goodness. It is a terrible, terrible moment in human history, and in that moment, people don't know about the resurrection, so it's a moment of complete despair. And yet this thing is beautiful. It's unbelievably beautiful. And so you ask yourself, If a mere man can make such beauty out of such suffering, what can God make of the suffering of the world in his greater design? And I think the question of evil really is a question of how small we are and how hard it is to understand the mind of God. And that is what faith is. Faith is saying, yes, I believe that I am part of a beautiful design that when I see it will make perfect sense to me. But I don't think you can make that argument now. I don't think arguments have the power to overcome the sheer pain of suffering. Beauty in some way does, and faith in some way does. And we know this from people who suffer and yet continue to believe.